Hello students, today I am going to talk about the nature of the Indian state in the post-liberalization phase commencing with the 1990s. You know that India had inherited from her colonial past an economy which was in shambles. So planned economic development was a top priority. On top of that, India was surrounded by hostile neighbors, all of which necessitated an interventionist state and a strong state. But this undergoes a gradual change from the 1980s. An era of liberalization started in India, and the trend was gradually to dilute the strict licensing system that prevailed. When the Narasimha Rao government, shortly after assuming office in the mid-1990s, announced its intention to overhaul the workings of the Indian economy, many observers considered the plans of the then Finance Minister Manmohan Singh for the first time far too radical and incompatible with the demands of democratic politics. Gradually and increasingly it became clear, however, that India was going to veer away from the path of Nehruvian socialism and adopt policies to complement the rules of the game enunciated by global financial institutions like the World Bank, the IMF and the World Trade Organization. What was the rationale behind this new economic policy? Manmohan Singh explained in 1997. The grave economic crisis that we were confronting, plus the collapse of the command economy model in Eastern Europe, helped to change the mindset. Since the early 1980s, there was a growing feeling in the country that the old centralized planning model was not yielding the desired results. Several committees had recommended liberalization of the old control regime. The events of 1990-91 gave added impetus to this line of thinking. But there were domestic factors also which necessitated the change. First, I would like to mention the rise of the middle class. Although the rate of India's economic development has not been sufficiently high for the alleviation of its mass poverty, there has been a phenomenal growth of the upwardly mobile middle class, mainly due to the grossly unequal distribution of income and wealth in the country. And it has been estimated that the rise of this class appears to have embraced the consumerist ethos of contemporary Western capitalism all over India, and this accounts for almost a quarter of the population. Second, there has also been a reversal of ideology. What is also striking is a replacement of a commitment to social democracy by the open advocacy of capitalism and tacit alliance with feudalism. The ideological commitment of the Congress to democratic socialism and secularism at home and to anti-imperialism and non-alignment in foreign policy was being slowly abandoned in the 1980s. This reversal of the Congress ideology was as much due to the erosion of its mass base as to the personal leadership of Prime Minister Narasimha Rao, whose political views were at best centrist, if not entirely rightist. As such, he opened up the Indian economy to the transnational corporations of the G7 states in the name of globalization. There was also political realignment of caste formations. Earlier, the Congress was able to create a mass base for itself that cut across class, caste and communal divisions with the help of nationalism and anti-imperialism, the syncretic ideology of democratic socialism and a distorted form of secularism. But from the mid-1960s, the middle castes, which were relatively numerous and generally belonged to the propertied classes, shifted their political loyalty from the Congress to other political parties. As a result, the Congress lost a large part of its traditional support base among the proletariat as well as the propertied classes, lost power at the center, and ceased to be the most dominant structural unit of the Indian political system. And finally, I would like to emphasize the role of the regional parties which had started to mushroom. A large number of local and regional parties emerged, thus imparting a fragmented character to the Indian political structure. Most of these parties do not have any ideological commitment and thrive on ethnic, linguistic, and regional chauvinism or purely anti-incumbency negativism. They have little interest in the broader ideologies and issues of national politics and are willing to sail with the dominant party in a coalition on all these matters. This gives a more or less free hand to the dominant partner in a central coalition government to pursue its national or international objectives according to its own class interests and ideologies. Explaining India's approach to globalization, Jenkins observes that the main feature of India's approach was a pattern of gradual reform on any single issue. This involved a strategy of carefully laying a foundation by using less transparent means of initiating change in an effort to avoid direct political confrontation for as long as possible. The objective is to provide more conducive circumstances under which further changes can be effected at a later date, when potential supporters of change are more likely to prove politically useful and opponents less capable of mounting resistance. So what are the manifestations of this liberalization that is beginning to unfold in India from the 1980s and gaining prominence with the 1990s? The most far-reaching reforms have definitely taken place in the realms of trade and industrial policy. The import licensing system was abolished. By 1992, the system had been effectively dismantled, with several notable exceptions such as sugar production. Combined with substantial relaxation of the MRTP Act, which had severely restricted the activities of the large business houses, industrial delicensing resulted in a spurt of private sector investment and corporate restructuring. This higher level of business activity in turn led to further regulatory anomalies that necessitate additional reforms in policies relating to taxation, share markets, foreign joint ventures, and infrastructure. Its most important implication in political terms has been to take decisions about the setting of new projects away from the hands of bureaucrats in New Delhi and place them under the control of individual business concerns. In view of the desire to liberalize the economy, the 1991 industrial policy of the Government of India therefore stipulated that the government has decided to take a series of measures to unshackle the Indian industrial economy from the cobwebs of unnecessary bureaucratic control. These measures complement the other series of measures being taken by the government in the areas of trade policy, exchange rate management, fiscal policy, financial sector reform, and overall macroeconomic management. So we definitely witness a clear dismantling of the license Raj. In August 2009, whereby the most controversial Monopolies and Restrictive Trade Practices Act, commonly referred to as the MRTP Act, stands repealed and is replaced by the Competition Act 2002 with effect from 1st September 2009. The MRTP, you will remember, was a grim reminder of the license quota permit Raj of the 1970s and the 1980s, and the act had become redundant after July 1991, when the new economic policy of the government was announced. The Government of India also opened up to the private sector industries that had previously been the sole preserve of state-owned enterprises. But along with industry, we also find reforms in the agricultural sector. These reforms, though not revolutionary in a genuine sense, did entail substantial efforts on part of Indian states to alter the ways in which governments treat cultivators, agricultural laborers, and carry on trade in agricultural commodities. What is also striking about the National Agricultural Policy 2000 is its categorical stipulation that the government will endeavor to create a favorable economic environment for increasing capital formation and farmers' own investments by removal of distortions in the incentive regime for agriculture, improving the terms of trade with manufacturing sectors, and bringing about external and domestic market reforms backed by rationalization of the domestic tax structure. But This liberalization policy had varying impacts across states of India. One must note that despite the enunciation of the policy of shifts by the Government of India, the states across India's federation did not perform similarly in terms of economic growth. Ashima Sena points out pertinently that despite the centrist uniform national policy framework in New Delhi, the regional states responded with divergent strategies towards the central regime, and their regional institutional structures varied widely. This variation in vertical strategies and regional institutions contributed to divergent interest rates in the large and small-scale private sector, as well as different infrastructural conditions for industry in the respective regions. Since the 1991 economic reforms, there has been strong industrial growth in India at an annual rate of 9%. However, not all Indian states have performed well since the dismantling of the Licence Raj. The highest rates of industrial growth were observed in the Indian states of Andhra Pradesh and Gujarat, which grew at more than 10% per annum. In contrast, however, Indian states of Assam, Orissa, Madhya Pradesh and West Bengal grew at a meager 3% or less per annum. So what were the perceptible changes in the post-1980 scenario? One could detect a set of interlocking institutional arrangements governing economic policy in India in the pre-1980 period. India's policymakers had closed the economy to international trade and riddled the private sector with extraordinary and cumbersome regulations which suffocated private economic activity as a result of various bureaucratic controls and impediments. Such a set of institutional arrangements was becoming increasingly incompatible with the change climate ushered in by the WTO regime. Changes therefore started happening in India post-1980 when India took the strides in the direction of liberalization and privatization towards free markets and open trade. Trade barriers were slashed, foreign investment was welcomed, the Licence Raj was effectively dismantled, and the welcome effects of such changes started manifesting themselves in much higher rates of economic growth. But one has to be also mindful that this growth which we are talking about is not entirely because of liberalization. What needs to be reiterated is that the Indian growth story cannot be attributed simply to a process of liberalization signaled by the end of a highly interventionist state and an import substitution trading regime. Rather, it was the pro-business tilt which accelerated economic growth in India after 1980. As Kohli points out, clearly the simple-minded hypothesis that more you liberalize, the more you grow is not borne out by cross-national evidence from the developing world. Hence, the state ought to feature as a prominent actor in the Indian growth story. The state is not getting eclipsed by liberalization. And state-business relations matter in a big way for explaining growth in future. Growth in India accelerated after 1980 because the state embraced the policy of economic growth and endorsed the business groups as the main political ally. In other words, growth success or failure is not much a function of the degree but the quality of state intervention. Identifying variations in how states are organized and in the institutional relationship of the state to the private sector lies the key to the understanding of the relative effectiveness of state intervention in the economy. As Harris points out, the most stories of economic growth indicate a positive role on part of the state in relation to private business. In other words, state-business relations definitely matter in economic growth. However, the role of the state in relation to business must exist and operate in a context which can lead to substantial variations in the nature, quality and impact of state-business relations. Adrian Leftwich importantly observes that political processes occur in particular contexts and are influenced and shaped by a very wide range of complex and often overlapping factors like the formal political institutional architecture of the state, including constitutional features, distribution and formal control of state power as in a presidential presidential or parliamentary, a unitary or federal system, plus civil-military relationships and the position with regard to bureaucratic recruitment and incumbency. This is confirmed by the different developmental outcomes of the various states in India who have pursued their own local forms of state-business relations. And that also explains to a large extent how growth has differed across Indian states. The varying experiences of Indian states definitely needs to be highlighted. That despite uniform central policy interventions, regional states in India reveal different developmental trajectories explicable in terms of regional, political and institutional contrasts. Frankel draws attention to this reality. The 1999-2000 poverty rate figures show that in 13 states like Arunachal Pradesh and Assam, Orissa, Sikkim, Tripura, Uttar Pradesh and West Bengal among others, between 25% to 47% of the rural population live below the poverty line. Other studies have also affirmed that this importance of local or regional considerations. Local institutions definitely matter regarding whether industry in a region benefits or is harmed by the nationwide delicensing reform. So we are definitely witness to the heterogeneous effects of liberalization. Trade liberalization literature points to the heterogeneous effects depending upon the institutional setting in which liberalization unfolds. Indeed, the focus should be squarely on the local policy and institutional environment, both contemporary and historical, in thinking about how to encourage growth in particular regions during periods of economic reforms. This is confirmed by Frankel. The social consequences of economic reforms confirm trends suggesting the emergence of two economies across the regional and social landscape of India. So what are these two economies that coexist in India? There is a smaller yet sizable affluent economy growing up in the larger cities and spreading to self-contained islands of export-oriented high technology parks, all the centers of the glass and the glitter. The spillover effects of an unemployment from proximity to knowledge sectors servicing global industries holds out hope to those at the margins of opportunities to join the growing lower middle classes and the middle classes. On the other hand, there is the larger predominantly agricultural economy of landless, marginal and small farmers, many belonging to historically disadvantaged lower castes, minority religions, tribal groups and women are on the other side of the divide. They have little expectation of a better future. They remain predominantly occupied with the daily struggle to secure their livelihoods. But is globalization responsible for this divide? It seems it may not be fair to hold globalization guilty of all the ills pertaining to poverty, unemployment, or underdevelopment that are discernible in contemporary India. Many of these have been continuing from yesteryears and have got aggravated through lapses and inadequacies on part of the state from the time of India's independence. And it is common knowledge that globalization is certainly not a level playing field. Globalization and liberalization have occasioned the state to abandon the closures and interventions that she earlier displayed in relation to certain spheres, particularly business and trade. True also, this abandonment has fostered an element of insecurity and uncertainty for many who feel unsure about the opportunities as well as their ability to optimize these opportunities that have been thrown up in an age of liberalization. There is also the intriguing question that with the inauguration of greater competitiveness, both nationally and internationally among the various stakeholders in the realm of business or trade, industry or agriculture, there will be winners, perhaps few, and losers, perhaps many, because many will not be in a position to take advantage of the opportunities unleashed by a process of liberalization. There is therefore an important role for the state to play. Probably more than ever before, the need for stronger measures of redistribution and reallocation are felt in liberalized India. But under all such possibilities and circumstances, an active role of the state is certainly not precluded. Neither does it suggest a departure from the welfare commitments of the state. The state has to emerge as an initiator of important institutional changes. If politics dominates the area of policy making, it will be no less dominant in the domain of policy implementation. We have seen in the case of the Forest Rights Act that one is definitely in need of ensuring intelligent activism geared towards building focused and effective coalitions both in the center and across the states for such pro-poor legislation to actually take off. This shows that the state will need to initiate additional complementary institutional changes so as to curb the attempts that are likely to frustrate the successful implementation of welfare measures for substantial sections of the Indian population, of which the Forest Rights Act is an example. Indeed, therefore, there is no shrinkage in the role of the state. In fact, there are other scholars who note a fundamental continuity in the role of the state in India, even in the age of liberalization. Nair observes that it is evident that there has been no withering or shrinking of the state, either subsequent to or as a consequence of liberalization. Rather, there has been a persistent expansion of the state. There has also occurred a marked shift in the approach to economic planning, where the emphasis is now placed on the social sectors in the move forward towards greater inclusiveness. The most visible symbol of the expanded commitment to inclusiveness is manifest in such schemes as the NREGA. So liberalization basically suggests a nuanced role for the state. Planning in a market economy, which is becoming increasingly integrated with the world, is bound to be different from what used to be earlier during the time of initial years of India's independence. Much of what used to be done by governments, including especially the establishment of production units producing manufactured goods and commercial services, is now being done by the private sector. This privatization, of course, was not visible earlier. India is blessed in having a long tradition of private entrepreneurship, and the private sector has responded magnificently to the new opportunities opened up by the age of economic reforms. So therefore, one has to conclude in the words of Manmohan Singh that liberalization does not mean that the role of the government must shrink. On the contrary, the government must play a much larger role in some areas, even as it shifts out from several others. And this is reiterated by Jagdish Bhagwati, who says that the state in a liberalized world is basically going to look upon itself as a manager of globalization, because globalization will throw up opportunities for some, and these opportunities will not be available to others who are in a rather depressed situation. So the state has to provide sufficient inputs to these sections, to these marginalized sections, so that they can take advantage of the opportunities opened up by globalization. All that basically has one clear pointer: the state will have a new role, a nuanced role, an important role, and a managerial role to play in an age of liberalization. Thank you.